When you're the leader of a country being invaded by a nuclear superpower, dependent on military aid from an unpredictable ally, standing in a dining room at a private club while that ally praises your enemy, logic says you have no leverage. You're supplicant, not partner. You take what's offered and say thank you. You don't make demands or issue ultimatums. But Volodymyr Zelensky turned the weakest diplomatic position imaginable into global moral authority and strategic advantage. This is how asymmetric diplomacy works, and it's a masterclass in turning weakness into strategy that deserves examination beyond the headlines and political theater. To understand what Zelensky accomplished, we need to start with his actual position when Russia invaded in February 2022. Ukraine was militarily outmatched by orders of magnitude. Russia had over 900,000 active military personnel. Ukraine had approximately 200,000. Russia's defense budget was roughly 12 times larger. Russia possessed nuclear weapons. Ukraine had given up its nuclear arsenal in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum in exchange for security assurances that proved worthless. Most military analysts gave Ukraine days, perhaps weeks, before the government fell. The United States offered to evacuate Zelensky. The assumption was that Kiev would fall quickly, Zelensky would flee, and Russia would install a puppet government. This wasn't pessimism. It was sober assessment based on military realities. Zelensky's response became instantly iconic. "I need ammunition, not a ride." This single sentence reframed the entire conflict. He wasn't running. He wasn't accepting inevitable defeat. He was staying to fight, which meant his people would fight too. And if he was willing to die defending Ukraine, Western nations would face moral pressure to provide the ammunition he requested. This was the first bluff, or perhaps not a bluff at all, but a calculated risk based on understanding psychological dynamics. Zelensky bet that his personal courage would shame Western nations into support they were initially reluctant to provide. And he was right. But to see this as just brave rhetoric misses the sophistication of what Zelensky was doing. He was constructing a narrative where Ukraine was Churchill's Britain in 1940, outnumbered, under assault, but defiant and worthy of support. And he was positioning himself as the Churchill figure, the leader who refuses surrender, even when defeat seems inevitable. The comparison to Churchill isn't accidental. Zelensky explicitly modeled his wartime communications on Churchill's approach during Britain's darkest hours. Churchill's speeches in 1940, "We shall fight on the beaches, never in the field of human conflict, their finest hour," didn't change military realities. Britain was still militarily weaker than Germany. Invasion was a real threat. But Churchill's rhetoric accomplished something crucial. It maintained British morale and convinced America that Britain was worth supporting. Churchill understood that wars are fought on psychological and political battlefields as much as military ones. When France fell in June 1940, many British leaders wanted to negotiate with Hitler. Churchill refused, arguing that Britain could hold out alone if necessary. This wasn't delusional optimism, it was strategic calculation. Churchill believed American entry was inevitable eventually, and Britain needed to survive long enough for that to happen. His speeches served multiple purposes. Domestically, they gave British citizens a narrative of heroic resistance rather than impending doom. Internationally, they signaled that Britain wouldn't surrender regardless of military odds, making Britain a worthwhile investment for American support. The rhetoric didn't win battles, but it created the political and psychological conditions necessary for eventual victory. Churchill also understood theater. His famous V for victory hand gesture, his visits to bombed neighborhoods, his bulldog persona, these were carefully constructed images designed to embody British defiance. Like Zelensky's green t-shirt, Churchill's public presentation communicated messages beyond his words. Zelensky studied this playbook carefully. His addresses to the Ukrainian people emphasized resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate victory, even when immediate prospects looked terrible. His addresses to Western parliaments emphasized shared values, moral obligation, and the broader stakes beyond Ukraine. He wasn't just asking for weapons. He was making Western support a matter of Western self-conception and values. The video addresses became part of the strategy. Zelensky appeared in military olive drab t-shirts, not suits. This visual choice was calculated. It said, "I'm not a politician playing diplomatic games. I'm a wartime leader in the trenches with my troops." The contrast with other world leaders in formal attire was stark and intentional. Zelensky looked like someone actually fighting, while others looked like bureaucrats discussing the fighting. His speeches to different parliaments were customized with specific historical and cultural references. To the British Parliament, he referenced Churchill directly. To the U.S. Congress, he invoked American revolutionary history and showed footage of Russian attacks. To the German Bundestag, he challenged Germany's historical failure to stop Russian aggression. Each speech was tailored to maximize emotional impact on that specific audience. This is sophisticated strategic communication. Zelensky wasn't just asking for help. He was making audiences feel that refusing help would be a moral failure and historical mistake. He was weaponizing guilt, invoking shared values, and positioning Ukraine as the front line of a broader civilizational struggle. The social media component was equally calculated. Zelensky's team produced regular video updates showing him in Kiev, demonstrating the government hadn't fled. These weren't polished productions. They often had rough audio and simple backgrounds. This rawness was part of the message. We're too busy fighting to worry about production values. The authenticity, real or performed, made the content more credible and shareable. When Russia claimed to have killed Zelensky or that he had fled, his team would release new video within hours showing him clearly alive and in Kiev. This rapid response capability kept Ukrainian morale high and Russian disinformation ineffective. It also maintained Zelensky's image as the leader who stayed when he could have left. Now consider what Zelensky accomplished strategically, despite having no conventional leverage. Ukraine received over $100 billion in military and economic aid from Western nations in the first 2 years of war. This included advanced weapon systems Western nations were initially reluctant to provide: HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot air defense, tanks, and eventually F-16 fighter jets. Each weapon system followed a similar pattern. Western nations would initially refuse, citing escalation concerns or capability limitations. Zelensky would publicly pressure them, often in dramatic speeches. Public opinion in Western nations would shift toward supporting Ukraine. Eventually, governments would reverse their positions and provide the weapons. The HIMARS story illustrates this perfectly. When Ukraine first requested long-range rocket artillery in spring 2022, the United States refused, arguing these systems could strike Russian territory and escalate the conflict dangerously. Zelensky responded by highlighting specific Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities that could have been prevented with long-range fires. He argued that escalation concerns protected Russian forces while Ukrainian civilians died. American and European media covered Ukrainian casualties extensively. Public opinion shifted toward providing more capable weapons. Members of Congress began pressuring the Biden administration. By June 2022, the U.S. announced HIMARS transfers. The systems arrived in Ukraine by late June and immediately impacted the battlefield, destroying Russian command posts and logistics hubs. The tank request followed similar dynamics. Germany and the United States initially refused to provide main battle tanks, citing training timelines and escalation risks. Zelensky made passionate appeals during visits to European capitals and in video addresses. The British broke the logjam by announcing Challenger 2 tank transfers. This created pressure on Germany and the U.S. to follow. Within weeks, both announced Leopard 2 and Abrams tank commitments. Fighter jets repeated the pattern again. F-16s were initially considered too escalatory and too complex for Ukrainian forces. Zelensky spent months publicly requesting them, emphasizing that Ukrainian pilots were ready to train and that air superiority was essential for success. Eventually, multiple European nations committed to F-16 transfers, with training beginning in 2023. This was asymmetric diplomacy in action. Ukraine had no military or economic leverage over Western nations, but Zelensky created moral and political leverage through narrative construction and public pressure. He made it politically costly for Western leaders to refuse Ukrainian requests because their own populations demanded support. The referendum proposal on territorial concessions demonstrated this strategy at its most sophisticated. Russia was demanding Ukraine's cede territory in the east, essentially accept dismemberment as the price of peace. This was militarily enforceable. Russia occupied these territories, and Ukraine lacked the strength to retake them quickly. Zelensky's response was tactically brilliant. He said Ukraine would hold a referendum. Let the Ukrainian people decide whether to accept territorial loss. This reframed the question from, "Will Ukraine surrender?" to "Will Ukrainians vote to surrender?" And he added a crucial condition. Russia must agree to a 60-90-day ceasefire before the referendum. This put Russia in an impossible position. If Russia agreed to the ceasefire, Ukraine would get months to rearm and fortify positions. If Russia refused, it would reveal that Russia didn't actually want peace. It wanted continued war to seize more territory. Either way, Ukraine gained strategic advantage from a position of weakness. The Mar-a-Lago meeting with Trump demonstrated this asymmetric diplomacy under maximum stress. Zelensky faced the worst possible diplomatic scenario. Trump had consulted with Putin for hours before the meeting. The meeting location was a dining room at Trump's private club, not the White House. Trump kicked the press out dismissively. During the press conference, Trump praised Putin and suggested Ukraine should make territorial concessions. Zelensky stood there maintaining composure while his country's supposed ally undermined his position publicly. The facial expressions captured on video, slight smirks, tight jaw, controlled reactions, showed the strain. But Zelensky didn't explode, didn't walk out, didn't publicly contradict Trump's absurd claim that Putin really wants to help Ukraine. Why not? Because losing his composure would give Trump an excuse to cut aid and would make Zelensky look like the problem. So he absorbed the humiliation, maintained diplomatic protocol, and let the images speak for themselves. The world saw Trump praising Russia while Zelensky stood silently beside him. The contrast made Trump look weak, and Zelensky look dignified. After the meeting, Zelensky gave interviews where he politely but firmly corrected the record. He stated clearly that Ukrainians won't accept territorial loss. He noted that Putin's actions don't suggest any desire to help Ukraine. He maintained that security guarantees must come before any negotiations. He did this without directly attacking Trump, which would have been counterproductive. This is high-level diplomatic craft. Zelensky extracted maximum value from a terrible situation. He used Trump's performance to highlight the difference between reliable allies, Canada, UK, Europe, and unreliable ones. He maintained Ukrainian positioning without burning bridges with an American administration he still needs, and he emerged looking like the adult in the room while Trump looked petty and Putin compromised. Compare this to how other leaders in weak positions have handled similar diplomatic challenges. Some become supplicants, desperately agreeing to whatever terms are offered. Others become defiant to the point of self-destruction, refusing any compromise and losing all support. Zelensky threaded the needle, maintaining Ukrainian red lines while keeping international support. Historical parallels are instructive. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it faced invasion by 5 Arab armies with vastly superior forces. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, had to conduct diplomacy from extreme weakness. His strategy was similar to Zelensky's: appeal to Western guilt over the Holocaust, frame the conflict as democracy versus authoritarianism, demonstrate that Israelis would fight rather than accept destruction, and make supporting Israel a moral imperative for Western nations. Ben-Gurion faced specific challenges that parallel Zelensky's situation. The United States had recognized Israel but imposed an arms embargo that applied equally to Israel and Arab states. Theoretically neutral, but practically disadvantageous since Arab states had British weapons, while Israel had almost nothing. Ben-Gurion needed to secure weapons while maintaining American political support. His approach combined public appeals and covert action. Publicly, he emphasized Israel's democratic character and the existential threat it faced. He positioned the conflict as the free world versus forces that had supported Nazi Germany, noting that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem had collaborated with Hitler. This messaging resonated with American audiences still processing the Holocaust's horrors. Covertly, Israel purchased weapons wherever possible. Czechoslovakia sold rifles and ammunition. American Jewish volunteers smuggled aircraft parts. Sympathetic individuals violated embargoes. When American officials discovered some of these activities, Ben-Gurion's public narrative provided cover. How could America morally object to Israel defending itself when Arab armies explicitly sought to complete Hitler's work? The strategy worked. American support, while officially cautious, became substantial. The arms embargo didn't prevent Israel from acquiring enough weapons to survive, and Israel's military performance, demonstrating that Israelis would indeed fight effectively, validated Ben-Gurion's rhetoric and secured continued support. Zelensky's approach mirrors this. He combines public moral appeals with practical requests for specific capabilities. He frames the conflict in terms that resonate with Western values. He demonstrates Ukrainian willingness to fight, which validates the investment of resources. And he creates political dynamics where supporting Ukraine becomes the morally and politically correct position for Western leaders. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam employed asymmetric strategy against the French and later Americans. He couldn't win militarily in conventional terms, but he could make the war so costly politically and morally for his opponents that they would eventually withdraw. His diplomacy emphasized Vietnamese determination, the justice of Vietnamese independence, and the impossibility of foreign powers imposing their will indefinitely. These historical examples share common elements with Zelensky's approach. Leaders of weak nations facing much stronger adversaries, using moral authority and international opinion as leverage, emphasizing the determination to resist regardless of material odds and making support for their cause a matter of principle, rather than just interest for other nations. What distinguishes Zelensky is the media environment. Churchill gave radio speeches. Ben-Gurion worked primarily through diplomatic channels. Ho Chi Minh's propaganda reached Western audiences slowly. Zelensky operates in real-time social media, reaching global audiences instantly with carefully crafted messages. This creates both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities. Zelensky can respond to Russian disinformation immediately, maintain continuous communication with global audiences, and bypass traditional media gatekeepers to make his case directly. Challenges. Every statement is scrutinized, mistakes are amplified, and maintaining consistent messaging requires constant attention. Zelensky's team has managed this remarkably well. The messaging stays disciplined. The visual presentation remains consistent. Military attire, simple backgrounds, serious tone. The requests escalate logically. First artillery, then air defense, then tanks, then planes. So each request seems like the natural next step, rather than unreasonable escalation. But there's a deeper strategic insight in Zelensky's approach that goes beyond communication tactics. He understood from the beginning that Ukraine's survival wasn't just a military question. It was a political and psychological question about whether Ukraine could maintain its identity as an independent nation in the minds of Ukrainians and the world. Russia's strategy wasn't just to conquer territory, it was to erase Ukraine as a concept. Russian propaganda claimed Ukraine was an artificial nation, that Ukrainian identity was fake, that Ukraine was historically part of Russia. If this narrative took hold, Ukrainian resistance would collapse. Why fight for something that doesn't really exist? Zelensky's response was to perform Ukrainian nationhood into existence through his leadership. Every speech, every video appearance, every act of defiance said, Ukraine exists. It has a government, a leader, an army, and a people willing to fight for it. This performative aspect of leadership is often overlooked, but crucial. Nations are partly constructed through narrative and symbolism, not just territory and institutions. The green T-shirt became a symbol of this. Unlike the suits that suggest peacetime bureaucracy, the military attire suggested permanent wartime mobilization. Zelensky was performing the role of wartime leader in ways that made Ukrainian resistance comprehensible and sympathetic to global audiences. He was making Ukraine real in the global imagination. The economic dimension of Zelensky's diplomacy deserves attention. Beyond military aid, Ukraine needed massive economic support. Zelensky secured commitments for over $100 billion in economic assistance by making Ukraine's economic survival a shared responsibility of the West. He positioned economic assistance not as charity, but as investment in collective security. Supporting Ukraine's economy meant supporting the fight against Russia. If Ukraine fell, Russia would threaten NATO members next. This framing made economic assistance politically palatable. The diplomatic calendar reveals strategic thinking. Zelensky timed major speeches and visits to coincide with key moments, right before NATO summits, during Western defense debates, when new weapon systems were being considered. This maximized pressure and media attention. It also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Western political cycles and decision-making processes. The coordination with other Ukrainian officials showed organizational discipline. While Zelensky became the global face of resistance, other Ukrainian leaders maintained relationships with specific countries or handled specific issues. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba focused on diplomacy. Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov managed military assistance. This division of labor kept diplomatic channels open and pressure consistent across multiple fronts. But all of this ultimately rests on military performance. Zelensky's diplomacy would have meant nothing if Ukrainian forces had collapsed immediately. The initial defense of Kiev, the successful counteroffensives in 2022, the ongoing resistance, these military achievements validated Zelensky's rhetoric. He could claim Ukraine was fighting successfully because Ukraine was actually fighting successfully. This creates a reinforcing dynamic. Military success enables effective diplomacy, which secures resources that enable further military success. Zelensky managed both the diplomatic and military political dimensions to create this positive feedback loop. When military situations worsened, he adjusted messaging to maintain support without seeming desperate. When situations improved, he leveraged successes to request more advanced capabilities. The Trump challenge represents the ultimate test of this asymmetric diplomacy. Zelensky needs American support, but faces an American president apparently more sympathetic to Russia than to Ukraine. How do you conduct diplomacy when your most important partner's leader is compromised? Zelensky's approach has been to go around Trump when possible, building relationships with Congress, with European allies, with military officials, while maintaining minimal necessary relationship with Trump himself. He doesn't publicly attack Trump, which would be counterproductive, but he also doesn't concede to Trump's pressure for territorial surrender. The referendum proposal was perfect for this situation. It appeared accommodating. Ukraine is willing to consider territorial concessions if the people vote for it. But it actually bought time and maintained Ukrainian position because, 1. Any referendum would almost certainly reject territorial loss. 2. Russia would never accept the ceasefire condition. And, 3. The proposal made Zelensky look reasonable while exposing Russian intransigence. This is what asymmetric diplomacy looks like, finding ways to advance your interests despite lacking conventional power. Zelensky can't force Trump to support Ukraine. He can't force Russia to withdraw. But he can make it politically and morally costly to abandon Ukraine. He can make supporting Ukraine seem aligned with Western values and interests. He can make himself and Ukraine into symbols that carry weight beyond military facts. The long-term implications of Zelensky's approach extend beyond Ukraine's immediate survival. He's demonstrated that small nations facing aggression from larger neighbors aren't helpless if they conduct effective strategic communication. The playbook he's developed, personal courage, narrative construction, public pressure, moral framing, social media mastery, will be studied and copied by future leaders in similar positions. But there are also cautionary elements. This approach works partly because of Zelensky's specific skills and personality. He was an actor and comedian before becoming president, someone who understands performance, timing, and audience. Not every leader has these capabilities. The approach also works because Ukraine's situation maps onto existing Western narratives about democracy versus authoritarianism. Other conflicts might not fit these narratives as neatly, and ultimately, asymmetric diplomacy can only accomplish so much. Zelensky has kept Ukraine in the fight and maintained international support far longer than expected, but he hasn't achieved Ukrainian victory or full territorial restoration. Diplomacy from weakness can create leverage and extend timelines, but it can't substitute for material power entirely. The Mar-a-Lago dining room moment crystallizes this reality. Zelensky demonstrated diplomatic skill and personal courage. He maintained composure under humiliating circumstances. He extracted what value he could from a terrible situation. But he still had to stand there while Trump praised Putin and suggested Ukraine surrender territory. The constraints of weakness remain real even when managed skillfully. Yet what Zelensky accomplished shouldn't be minimized. Ukraine still exists as an independent nation. Its government hasn't fallen. Its territory, while partially occupied, hasn't been completely conquered. International support, while inconsistent, continues. None of this was inevitable. All of it required diplomatic skill in addition to military resistance. The bluff that worked wasn't a single moment, but a sustained strategic approach. Zelensky bluffed, or perhaps bet, that his courage would inspire his people. That bet paid off. He bluffed that Western nations would support Ukraine if he made refusing support politically costly. That bet largely paid off. He bluffed that he could maintain positioning while absorbing humiliation from leaders like Trump. That bet is still playing out. Asymmetric diplomacy is fundamentally about managing perceptions and creating leverage where none should exist based on material facts alone. Zelensky has demonstrated mastery of this art. Whether it proves sufficient to secure Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity remains uncertain. But it's already proven sufficient to keep Ukraine fighting when most analysts expected rapid collapse. This is the essence of the bluff that worked. Zelensky convinced the world, and crucially convinced Ukrainians, that Ukraine could resist. And because enough people believed it, it became true. Not completely true. Ukraine still faces enormous challenges, but true enough that the nation survives and fights on. That's the power of asymmetric diplomacy conducted with skill from positions of extreme weakness. The dining room at Mar-a-Lago represents a moment in this larger story. Zelensky stood in that room without conventional leverage. He couldn't threaten Trump or force concessions. He could only maintain dignity, speak truth carefully, and trust that the contrast between his bearing and Trump's behavior would work to Ukraine's advantage. It did. Trump looked petty and compromised. Zelensky looked principled and resolute. And the asymmetric diplomacy continues.